Hello everyone, my name is Emily Koech, and with me in the group presentation is Jesse and Hanbu. The topic we are handling is epistemology, and I'm going to introduce the topic by defining what is epistemology. Epistemology is a branch of philosophy that deals with the nature of knowing, or that studies knowledge, its nature, sources, limits, and validity. Based on this, we are going to review on articles given in the syllabus for week 3.
Friends, I share the article Theology, a Very Short Introduction, was written by David Ford. The author David Ford is an Anglican public theologian. His research interests include political theology, ecumenical theology, hermeneutics, and interfaith theology, and relations too. First of all, he touched the fundamental question of people's inner selves about God's reality and knowing God in their relationship with their neighbors. With his writings, he would like to change the scenario of traditional imperialistic Christian society to have a different kinds of approach in Christian theological understanding. For Ford, there is no one distinct form of theological understanding and knowing. He has taken an integrative approach, encouraging people to ask a wide range of questions. Secondly, the critical issue in this article, he focuses not just on accumulating knowledge, but also on the role of experience and wisdom in shaping people's theological understanding. His writing poses a real challenge for readers to adopt a theology which is inclusive while remaining rooted in the past. So, it is an inclusive approach to understanding and knowing the reality of God and embracing all people as God's people. Thirdly, his writings shaken people's understanding of God to look at what sort of person was Jesus. What is the framework in our religious teachings to understand the reality? How do we need to behave towards God, other people, and creation in our daily lives? How is the Bible to be interpreted? How should different religion traditions relate to each other? And also, what about evil? For this, he explains epistemology is the branch of philosophy that deals with the nature of knowing. In the West, there were lots of debates on epistemology for nearly 3 centuries, particularly the deep differences about how world, self, and language should be understood in relation to each other. For example, this with a triangular illustration, the issues between the 3 angles, knowledge, meaning, and truth. David Ford talks about Western epistemology from 16th century to 19th century. How philosophers associated on the relation of self and world. But 20th century, the third element of language has come into increasing prominence. Some theologians will adopt new epistemology and try to rethink the theological questions, but others just ignore completely. So, David Ford is explaining 3 ways in this complex minefield of epistemology. First, conception of knowledge that are oversimplified and inappropriate. Second way he introduces is the Christian conception of God. Finally, he suggested wisdom as the most helpful single term for understanding and knowing good theology. He suggests in the engagements the theological conclusions differed from our own. When he explains about the question around knowing an apple, he encourages the final move in epistemology is to notice to go beyond the apple to do action. So, experiencing, understanding, judging, and deciding still go on. So, appropriate knowing, the watchword David Ford is introducing. But appropriate knowing also takes us a great deal of trouble and leads us to know inappropriate knowing too. So, we have to watch the temptation to oversimplify the questions of knowing. We can ask the questions, what is appropriate knowing in relation to God? Christian conception of God, God's Trinity. Related with epistemology, David Ford explored what might be involved in affirming the reality of that triune God. He said, being known. God is not an object in the world like an apple. God is more like a human being. But only difference in knowing Christian God is that God is conceived to have the complete initiative in how God is known. That does not rule out our questioning and searching and understanding, but does rule out imagining ourselves as somehow in control in the process of knowing God. So, theological knowing is required an exercise in trying to imagine knowing while being known by God. David Ford talks about 9 principles in knowing appropriate to the Christian God. Sometimes I find it very difficult to say Christian God and other gods. Critically, I'm thinking within myself. But his principles is very good. I would like to share the title of those principles. The first one is interest and questions. Secondly, methods. Third, individual and social learning. Fourth, instantaneous and long-term knowing. Fifth, distinct and interconnected knowing. Sixth one, language and reference. Then human subjectivity. Then the next one is fallibility and corrigibility. The final one, he would like us to take as well. All of us, not only we should not stop in the principles. We have to move forward. That is decisions and action. We are shaped by what we decide and do, isn't it? Our main decision turns into different person. Knowing God is not in dispute. This God of love is known through loving, being loved even though we are surrounded by many, many differences. Finally, David Ford is talking about the basic, the theology as wisdom. That is the question he is dealing with. How might all of us held together? Wisdom, he meant how we relate to one another's dimensions of reality. How we relate to other dimensions of reality. It is not concerned about more information and knowledge. It embraces whole ecology of God's creation. It resonates with major religious and philosophical traditions. So, theology is a discipline which enables us how to face differences. The learning, teaching, and enriching of such wisdom in small ways, one begins to appreciate the passionate which overflows in so many communities, scriptures, liturgies, and personal testimonies.
My topic is Reimagining the Human. The author for this article is Eliezer S. Fernandez. Eliezer S. Fernandez is a Filipino-American theologian and scholar specializing in constructive theology, theological anthropology, and liberation theology. He is recognized for his work in reimagining the human experience through a theological lens that addresses systematic evils such as classism, racism, sexism, and environmental degradation. Fernandez's work focuses on the intersection of theology and social justice, particularly in the context of Global South. His notable publications include Reimagining the Human, Theological Anthropology in Response to Systematic Evil in the year 2004, and Toward a Theology of Struggle in the year 2008, Meditations on the Journey in the year 2023. These works explore theological anthropology, the study of what it means to be human in relation to the divine, by critically examining how systematic evils distort human identity and relationship. Fernandez argues that these evils are deeply rooted in the idolatry and false securities, and he advocates for a theology that promotes liberation and transformation. He writes Reimagining the Human from the context of the Global South, particularly shaped by the social, economic, and political realities of the Philippines. He addresses the systematic evils, poverty and economic exploitation, racism and colonial legacies, sexism and patriarchy, environmental degradation, and the idolatry of power and security that distort human identity and relationship. Fernandez's theological anthropology in relational and liberative, he argues that to be truly human is to resist these structures of oppression, affirm the dignity of all people, and live in communion with God and one another. His work reimagines humanity through a lens of justice, care, and transformation, emphasizing that theology must engage the concrete realities of marginalized communities to restore human flourishing. The summary of the key systematic evils Fernandez identifies in reimagining the human and how they shape his theological anthropology: economic exploitation and class oppression, racism and colonial legacies, sexism and patriarchy, environmental degradation, idolatry of power and security. In overall theological anthropology, Fernandez's anthropology is relational and liberative. Humanity is defined not by domination or privilege, but by justice, love, and communal responsibility. The call to be human involves resisting systemic evils and participating in God's redemptive work in the world. He reframes traditional theology to address concrete social realities, especially in context shaped by oppression in the global south. From a context deeply shaped by systematic injustice, particularly in the global south, and his experience as a Filipino theologian and pastor, the context can be understood along several interconnected dimensions: global and local social context, theological context, philosophical and ethical lens, practical and pastoral context. In short, Fernandez's context is a global south, post-colonial and socially unequal world where theology must speak to both the spiritual and socio-political dimensions of being human. Reimagining the human seeks to articulate a vision of humanity liberated from systemic evils and oriented towards justice, dignity, and community. His main concerns: he addresses several interconnected concerns arising from social, political, and theological realities, particularly in the Philippines context. These concerns focus on how systemic structures and human practices distort what it means to be fully human. Systemic oppression and injustice, racism and colonial legacies, sexism and patriarchal structures, environmental degradation, idolatry of power, security, and institution. Theological misunderstanding of humanity. Traditional theological anthropology often reflects elite Western perspectives that ignore the lived realities of marginalized communities. Fernandez is concerned with how structural and cultural injustices, along with distorted theological notions, compromise human dignity and relationships. His work calls for liberative, relational, and justice-oriented understanding of humanity grounded in God's redemptive purposes. His critical issues, if we see, we can see the perspective works together to create a holistic vision. Liberation identifies the problem. Constructive theology proposes a reimagined identity. Contextual analysis ensures relevance, and ethical environmental concerns extend the scope of responsibility. To conclude, reading Eliezer Fernandez Reimagining the Human through the lenses of liberation, constructive, post-colonial, and ethical environmental theology has significantly broadened my understanding of epistemology, particularly regarding how knowledge of humanity is formed, validated, and applied. Traditionally, epistemology emphasizes abstract reasoning, logic, and universal principles. Fernandez challenges this by showing that knowledge about what it means to be human cannot be separated from social, historical, and ethical realities. For example, the liberation theology perspective highlights that understanding humanity requires attending to the lived experiences of the oppressed. Knowledge is not purely theoretical, but embodied and socially situated. The constructive theological perspective emphasizes that human understanding is dynamic and relational, suggesting that epistemology must account for transformation and praxis, not only observation or deduction. Meanwhile, the post-colonial and contextual lenses remind me that knowledge is often shaped by power, culture, and historical context, calling for critical reflection on whose knowledge counts and how systemic biases distort truth. Finally, the ethical and environmental perspectives expand epistemology to include responsibility and relationality, demonstrating that knowing involves not only comprehension but also action towards justice and care for creation. Thank you.
I'm going to analyze about Margaret Burrick's Women Are Invisible. Margaret Burrick was a Swiss theologian, feminist thinker, and activist. She was active in the ecumenical movement, in bracket World Council of Churches, Federation of Swiss Protestant Women, and was known for pushing churches and theological institutions to recognize women's roles, voices, and perspectives. As a theologian, she approached her work from both faith and social activism, grounding her theology in liberation and gender justice. The context she is writing out of are four, and the first one is historical context, written during 1970s to 1980s, when feminist theology was emerging as a critique of male-centered theology in church and academy. Theological context, traditional theology shaped by patriarchal assumption largely ignored women's perspective and experience. That is what she said about his theological context. In the social context, she said, in the wake of second wave feminism, women in society and church were demanding recognition, equality, and participation. In his personal context, as a Reformed theologian in Europe, Burrick was engaging both in biblical studies and the structures of church life that excluded women. The concerns the author is addressing are women's voices, experience, and realities are absent from theological reflection and church structures. Secondly, is that theology is presented as universal and objective, while in reality, being shaped almost entirely by male perspective. The third one is that methodologies in theology and research must be re-examined so that they include gender experience and the hermeneutics of women's lives. The critical issues in this article are the invisibility of women in theology. Women are not only absent as subjects, but also interpreters. Meaning of that theology is distorted and incomplete. Another critical issue in the article is that the need for methodological change. She argues for a feminist rethinking of theological method that acknowledges context, experience, and the voices of women. And another critical issue is power and authority in theology. The main monopoly over theological discourse reinforces patriarchal power in both church and society, and this must be dismantled by authentic theology to emerge. In summary, Purik is pressing the case that theology cannot claim truth or universality unless it integrates women perspectives, challenges patriarchal assumptions, and reconstructs its methodology in light of justice and inclusion. Thank you.
The meaning of revelation is the article written by Daniel L. Migliore. Daniel Migliore is a prominent theologian and scholar known for his significant contributions to the fields of systematic theology and Christian thought, with a keen focus on the interplay between faith and reason. His academic work often bridges the gap between the traditional doctrines and contemporary issues. In this modern world, the word revelation resonates the book of Revelation and bring many confused positions of Christians' understanding about revelation. He writes, Christian theology explores the basis of affirmations about God, focusing on how believers perceive God and creation through scripture, the church's witness, and human intellect. He pointed out how we say together that in the church, Christian creeds, I believe or we believe, and he questioned on what grounds the community of faith makes its affirmation about God. What is the source of knowledge and what kind of knowledge it is? He defines, first of all, what is revelation. Revelation is an unveiling of profound truths that alter our self-understanding. It includes a significant biblical events where God communicates with the individuals. Scripture is filled with accounts of revelation. For example, Moses heard the voice of God. Isaiah had a vision. Paul had a revelation. Peter had a dream, and so on. He talks about God hidden and revealed. Most of the critics argue that the significance of revelation is overstated, suggesting it attracts from salvation concerns. True faith involves trust and obedience, recognizing God's hiddenness and mystery. So, Daniel Migliore is saying, whatever may be the case in other forms of knowledge, in the knowledge of God given in revelation, God does not become a prisoner or categories and concepts. God remains free. Every mystery, ever hidden. Hiddenness of God in the Christian theological tradition is the confession that in Jesus Christ, crucified and risen, God is truly revealed, yet also paradoxically hidden. Revelation as objective and subjective events, that is human experience subjectivity, emphasizing a combined act of divine disclosure and personal response. Christ is not just a truth, but the truth that sets humanity free, not just a light, but the light that illuminates all of life, which is mentioned in John's Gospel. The author differentiates two kinds of revelation, such as special revelation and general revelation. General revelation is seen in nature and conscience, while special revelation is specific historic events, with the incarnation of Jesus being most significant, challenging previous understanding of divine knowledge. He is defending, most Christian theologians today would be more generous than Calvin in finding truth and values in what we can be known of God in the created order, in human conscience, and in the different religions of humanity. Then he explains the models of revelation from Avery Duttle's 5 models of revelation, such as authoritative doctrine, particular historical events, special inner experience, dialectical presence, a new awareness leads to transformation, which are highlighting different aspects, but saying that each with the strength and limitations. So he is suggesting there is a need for a comprehensive understanding of divine self-disclosure. He also talks about revelation as God's self-disclosure narrated in Scripture. Christian doctrine considers Jesus' life, death, and resurrection as key revelations of God, inviting ongoing transformation and a dynamic relationship with the living God. Overall, understanding revelation is multifaceted in Scripture, but it requires communal engagement and fostering a transformative relationship with God while acknowledging God's ultimate freedom and mystery. For the author Daniel Migliore, in Christian theology, the word revelation refers primarily not to the Bible or creed or set of doctrines or ecclesiastical authority, but it refers to the whole of triune God's activity in creation, redemption, and consummation that has its center in Jesus Christ, his life, death, and resurrection. The free grace of God in Jesus Christ is the core message and the focus of a Christian doctrine of revelation. These are the meaning of revelation the author is talking about. Thank you.
I would like to pose you a discussion question for you. What counts as knowledge? Knowledge includes experiences of marginalized communities, not only abstract theory. Human identity and ethics are best understood relationally and contextually. Second, how do we know what we know? Through a combination of theological reflection, lived experience, and critical engagement with societal structures, emphasizing praxis over abstraction. And my third would be, why does it matter? Because epistemology shapes how we understand humanity and act in the world. A narrow or biased understanding can perpetuate oppression, while a contextually informed, ethically grounded epistemology promotes liberation and justice. So, in summary, Fernandez perspectives transform epistemology from a detached study of knowledge into a practical, relational, and justice-oriented inquiry where knowing is inseparable from ethical responsibility, social context, and human flourishing. Thank you.
On personal engagement and application, reading these perspectives has reshaped my understanding of epistemology. I now see it not just as the study of knowledge, but as a question of whose knowledge counts in theology. From Ford, I learned the value of humility and dialogue in pursuing truth. From Pula Purik, I realized that invisibility is itself an epistemological problem. When women are ignored, theology becomes distorted. From Fernandez, I was challenged to see how epistemology must confront systematic injustice and be reoriented towards liberation. Application to my own context and presentation. As a Kenyan woman, pastor, and a student in America setting, these readings make me attentive to my own positionality in theology. My experience brings unique insights, but I must also recognize how I might unconsciously reproduce silence. In church leadership, I can apply Pula-Purik challenges by intentionally amplifying women's voices. Fernandez pushes me to see how colonial and global power structures still shape church and society, calling me to promote liberative knowledge. David Ford encourages me to hold all these insights together in dialogue, seeking wisdom that serves the flourishing of all. Discussion question I will carry into presentation. Number 1, whose knowledge is being centered or excluded in my church and theological practice? Second question, how can epistemology serve not only truth seeking, but also justice and liberation? And the third question, what does it mean in my context to do theology as a dialogue rather than dominion? Thank you.
Concluding our presentation, I would like to share my personal call. I heard God's call while I was worshipping in my village church at the age of 21 years old. I understood God was specifically calling me to go to Ethiopia to share the good news. So I rushed back home to share this good news with my parents. My father said, "Jesse, not now, because my responsibility is to arrange a marriage for you. After marriage, wherever you want to go, you can go." I was so sad and kept this in prayer. Every day, daily scriptural reading strengthened me. I never been to Ethiopia, but rather we entered into the UK. There I was working as a asylum support officer in the diocese. I am able to find out an Ethiopian sitting beside me. Years later, after my ordination, I worked in a village parish. There, I heard another story of an Ethiopian. He was part of that church community for many, many years. When he died, people buried him as he was very faithful in sharing his Christian faith among them, especially in the community. Knowing these incidents made to shed light on my revelation. I have seen an Ethiopian grave and I met an Ethiopian refugee woman in the UK, not in Ethiopia. I realized my call is to serve people from Ethiopia rather than the country Ethiopia. God is faithful in His calling to fulfill His revelation. This is a meaningful revelation. Stay with me to see God's beautiful action related with His faithful revelation. He is faithful. Friends, I also learned how to listen to others and to increase the knowledge of God-given experiences in revelation. Thank you.